Okay, we've been talking about the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. We've been talking about the early years, and really, as I came into the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Church in its very, very early years, first in 1971 at the Second General Conference of the Universal Fellowship. I came in as a feminist, part of the Women's Studies program at Sacramento State University, and California State University at Sacramento, which with our getting our Women's Caucus and then our Women's Studies program. We had the second Women's Studies program in the United States. And I was very, very strong feminist. So when Troy came along and MCC came along, I brought my feminism into MCC, and it was at a time when the role of women in the church was pretty low. And there's stories to be told as we struggled for inclusive language far before any other church was even talking about inclusive language, or what language did, how language defined us, the way we spoke, the way we interpreted things. So from 1972 till 1981, I was totally involved as I became an elder. I was totally involved in the women's movement and in gay rights, but the church had to be as much about the role of women in the Christian church as it was about the homosexuals in the church. And surprisingly, Metropolitan Community Church, although it was probably about 90% male at the time when I came in, was very supportive, was willing to take up that role. And of course it was a sort of a It was a back and forth sort of a thing, moving forward, go 1 inch forward, a step, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, clashes, just new wine and a new wineskin is what MCC was. We came from everywhere, and from every conceivable religious background, and every conceivable way of looking at the world, and somehow, by God, we were going to be a church, and we were going to change the world. So we struggled, and this is really important, that we became a cohesive body of new wine, effervescent and bubbling, and hitting over each other, but going forward. And finally, in 1981 in Houston, Texas, we put inclusive language into the governance of our church, that we were going to use inclusive language. And we left 1981 bruised and battered and beaten and wearing buttons that said, "I survived MCC Conference 1981, Houston." Wow. But see, what we didn't know, 1981, there we were totally involved. We were a very, very young church. People today probably could not even conceive about what a young church we were, because we were mostly made up of gay and lesbian people. And the people who loved us, and people who saw things, but most of the older settled gay people were in the closet. They had careers, they had jobs, they had reputation. They couldn't risk. But we were young, and we could risk. Troy founded the church when he was 28 years old, the denomination. And we were just young and effervescent and just full of life, leaving Houston. We're going to be having then our next conference 2 years later was going to be in Toronto, Canada. But what we didn't know is while we were at conference that summer, the CDC started noticing a rare ailment, that young gay men were dying. They called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And there were starting to be little scientific papers written that in New York and in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, there were these little clusters, and they were getting like Kaposi sarcoma. They were getting where they had purple lesions on their bodies, and they were getting wasting disease, and they were getting pneumocystis, which was a disease of older people whose immune system was giving out, and the medical community was was very concerned with this, not terribly concerned because they weren't that concerned about the gay community, but there was just this ripple of there's something new going on. But we didn't know. I mean, we were just, came off of this conference that we survived, somehow got through, passed incredibly world-changing, it's turned out to be world-changing legislation out of us that we would hear. And of course nobody knew it. If a tree falls in the forest, nobody hears. Did it really happen? Did it make a sound? Well, we made a lot of noise in Houston, and what ultimately will be the result, is yet to be known. But we'd done incredible things in Houston, and we were young, and we were proud, and we were just full of life, and getting ready to go into Toronto for our conference. But by the time we got to conference, it was well known that something was happening with the gay men, some drug users, and Haitians, and hemophiliacs, that they were developing these incredible immune deficiency diseases. Why they were getting them, nobody knew, but in all of our churches, someone was getting sick. Someone was getting sick. But this was just this faint ripple as we went into General Conference in Toronto. But it was alarming. It was alarming. And that was the beginning of AIDS, that it moved into our denomination, because our denomination was made up, at that time, it was more male than female. We were young people that were just had the sense of liberation, that we'd been under, we'd grown up under oppression, both from outside and from inside, the way that we saw ourselves, the way the world told us we needed to see ourselves. And we just were out of that, and we were so effervescent, and we were also young. And something was starting to happen. And the world was being called, I believe, at that time, 1983, I think it was still being called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency disease. But some scientists were looking for what it was, what made that happen. And so when we went to the conference in Toronto, there was a concern about it. But what we didn't know in Toronto in 1983 was that probably a third of the men at that conference or in our churches carried the HIV virus.
Wow.
Which was not even known. That HIV is a very slow developing illness. By the time you get to where your immune system has been compromised, that you can get opportunistic diseases, that's far along in the disease itself. But what we didn't know, but we did know that here and there we had members of our church dying of this disease. And we had no way of knowing what it was, but we were beginning to understand that there was an illness. And we were also beginning to understand that while the world did not think much of us anyway, because of the cultural biases and everything, but they also now began to looking at the gay community as being diseased and somehow a danger and infected. And as the news came out more and more, many of us were who say, like myself, my brother, whom I love very much, as he became aware, he's very, very science-minded. He wanted me to get away from my church and stay away from my church because we didn't know how contagious it was.
Right.
And then people started getting the Kaposis sarcomas, they started getting the pneumocystis, and started dying. And it became huge. There's no way of getting around how huge AIDS became in Metropolitan Community Church.
All that talk from outside, the churches condemning or labeling, Was there any part of that that ever had you questioning, is there something to that, or were you just...
No, well, okay, no, there was no way I would leave. There was no way, I mean, I was incredibly concerned, and we had no way of knowing, but no, that we were getting more information, but we were, as a church, I never hesitated to hug and to kiss. We always were hugging and kissing people, to hug and to kiss people and to be with people, and it just was this thing that was moving in on us that was so hard to understand. But
when did it first hit?
First hit Sacramento.
MCC,
Okay,
yeah.
Here's now we're moving. General Conference after Toronto in '83 was going to be '85 in Sacramento, my hometown. We had that. And right before conference, we had this young man named Gary Johnson. He was part of our choir, beautiful young man, young, probably 23, 24 years old. He came into my office. And there's an MCC, even now, but at that time, our offices were very open for people. Anyone who needed to talk about anything, they'd come in. And anyway, Gary made an appointment with me, and he came and he talked to came into my office, and he sat down, and he held out his arm, and he says, "Do you feel that?" And I went on his arm like that. And it seemed like there was a lump. There seemed like a bump. And he said, "I've got AIDS." I said, "Well, Gary, how can you know that?" He says, "Well, I know it." He says, "And I've been talking to Dr. Thompson." We had 2 gay male doctors in Sacramento at that time who both died of AIDS.
Oh, wow.
I mean, the upstart of this, as we're going forward, is you need to understand that 1/3 of our denomination, male, and a lot of women too, women got it, but died of AIDS. And from that moment on, from the time that Gary walked into my office with the case, KS, Kaposi sarcoma, it never stopped. Gary did develop the symptoms of AIDS, and he did die, and his family out in Rancho Cordova called because Gary had asked for me to do the funeral, and I went out to talk to his family. And his mother said, "Gary wants you to do the funeral." She says, "But we don't want anyone from your church there." She says, "And nobody is to know what he died of." That was a time when the coroners didn't want to, they didn't know how it was being spread. That all of a sudden, men in the gay community, if it was known they were gay, were untouchables. They, many times, they weren't treated well or anything. We had, as I said, 2 gay doctors in Sacramento, Sandy Koufax and Dr. Thompson. But they both died of AIDS too, as before it was even known, before HIV was even identified. All of a sudden, instead of feminism, instead of inclusive language, instead of all of the things that were paramount in building a new young church, were put on the back burner. We became the Church with AIDS. We called ourselves the Church with AIDS. Our programs were all about how do we deal with AIDS. Our churches, Sacramento Church, where I was, not only the members of my church, but anyone in Sacramento who was gay, who was dying of AIDS, in their family, the ones who had left Sacramento to go to the big cities, they came home with AIDS to die. And I got to the point where I was doing maybe 2 or 3 funerals a week. I'd look out in my congregation to preach, and I knew the ones that I knew that had AIDS, but I knew the ones that didn't yet know they had AIDS or weren't saying it, because when we gave communion, you reach out, I would always reach out, and I'd cup the person like this, because we do a prayer. And I'd put my hands over their glands, and I'd feel the glands. And they were swollen. The lymph nodes were trying to get rid of the virus. And I'd look into their eyes. Some of them didn't know that their glands were swelling. But some of them did, because they had that look that I called the AIDS look. It was the look of someone bewildered, afraid, incomprehending. I saw that look in their eyes over and over and over again as I served communion. As part of the governing body of our denomination, I would travel, and our clergy were dying of AIDS. And we'd get together and we'd talk about AIDS when we were together, and we'd talk about the funerals. One young man in Pensacola, Florida, Troy and I were there for the church's anniversary. And he had HIV, but he had AIDS. But he was preaching, he was up there one day and he was preaching. And all of a sudden, his words stopped making sense. He started talking gibberish, and you could see in his face, I mean, he understood that what he was saying was not what he was trying to say. It was a dementia that you know, from AIDS, and I mean, you watched it, and it was everywhere. And so how do you deal? How do you deal with living through a plague? How do you deal with a president that won't even say the name of the disease? With a medical system that would go totally overboard in parvo, the dogs, or virus in cats, but didn't want to touch, did not even want to touch the AIDS problem. There was no research. The scientists were not working. Our people were dying. They were dying. How do you deal with it? Number one, you deal with it very human. You're in grief. There's absolutely no doubt about it. You are in grief, and you have to I had to let myself feel it. You know, if there's one thing that I have in my life, it's the fact that I can be real. Mm-hmm. That I'm a real person, and if I'm hurting, I'm hurting. If I'm in grief, I'm in grief. I was in so much grief one time. I was up in Montana. We'd flown in, and our pastor and former elder in San Francisco, Jim Sandmeyer, had just died of AIDS. Mm. And we were on a plane flying up to Montana together, and talking about Jim's funeral, because we did very elaborate funerals, very, very elaborate funerals. And we were talking about, you know, the censer that was being swung, and you know, just, you know, because he had a very elaborate funeral. And I went to sleep that night in the hotel room, and all of a sudden I was in a cold sweat, and I said, we're all dying. Mm-hmm. We're all dying. And yet, because of my faith, I knew that I had the one thing that was greater than AIDS. We had that was greater than AIDS. We had that peace that passes all understanding. We had a presence that would let us grieve but give us strength at the same time, and infuse us with hope when the world was saying there is no hope, and everywhere we looked. And certainly I was angry. I have a copy of a sermon that I preached at a general conference that was a very angry sermon because the world was just letting our people die. Mm-hmm. And the only thing that was being done underground. People act up, and people were starting in the gay community to search for cures, and we were trying so hard to get the cures. I'm going to get closer to home right now because that was on a general everywhere front. And we got to the point that this enormous movement came across the gay community in the United States, and I believe around the world, that we had to come out. I mean, before that, people were very guarded about their identity, and after that, that's when today started, was because right now people are saying, well, I didn't realize there were so many of them. That's because our community was hidden. But people came out. But in my church in Sacramento, my assistant pastor, Larry Dunlap, became ill. And I remember, I mean, he had such perfect faith. You know, they were so brave. Everyone I knew that as they faced up to the fact that they were dying of AIDS, and there was no hope. I mean, that was the diagnosis, no hope. You know, maybe you have 2 years or 3 years. But he was dying, and he got to the point where he couldn't even get out of bed, and I used to go out and crawl in the bed with him, and we'd sing hymns, and we'd pray, and we'd talk. And what we did, we planned his funeral, and because it was going to happen. We didn't have any choice, and so he decided his own funeral. And it was 3 hours long when it happened. It's the only funeral I ever had that had to have an intermission in it.
That's awesome.
Let people go to the bathroom and smoke. But like I said, he died. My music leader, Chuck Vickers, he died. I mean, everyone was dying, and they certainly were dying, and I was ministering. And I was loving them, and I was giving my very, very best that I knew how to give, and I was bone tired. And yet I had a source of strength that I'm very grateful for today. Anyway, death. It's hard. It's probably the hardest thing that you'll ever face. My great-grandmother, when I was 10 years old, had a stroke. She was in the bed next to me. I was staying with her because my mother was in the hospital having my baby sister, and we had people from the church over who had my bed, so I was with my great-grandmother. She had a stroke, and she rose up in bed, and she reached out like that. And that was, anyway, and I called for the church people, and they called an ambulance. They took my great-grandmother away. That was the last I saw her, but that was the first death, and I couldn't, it was just so devastating for me. And so death is always, you know, has always been, and I'm a Christian. I believe that there's something beyond. I believe that we have strength to go through what we need to go through when we need to go through it. I totally believe that, and it's very, very strengthening. But death is a very, very hard thing for me to handle, and I praise God. I never got calloused. I never got hardened. I absorbed it. I absorbed it, and I'd hold people like I held the people of the community, and I'd know they were dying, and I just held them. That's all I can say. So, death, and I pray God that I'll never be calloused about anything. I pray God that I will never be calloused about any human condition and suffering. I pray God that I will always be aware, and that I will always feel, and I will always react, and that I'll always be real about that. And yet I know it's going to come. I want to talk about tragic death too, not just AIDS, which was so devastating, you know, beyond comprehension, devastating. but as a pastor of the church in Sacramento, Metropolitan Community Church. We had, over the years, 2 very brutal murders, hate crimes, of our clergy. The first was in Stockton, California, in Stockton, MCC. And our pastor there, after a Sunday evening service, had come home from the church and for some reason he was counting the money. I don't know, we don't do that in MCC, but he was doing that. And he must have gotten a call because he got up and he left the church, and the next day he was found stabbed, I think, 47 times, an incredibly vicious murder. Troy was, our denomination head was on a cruise in the Caribbean, so I went to Stockton and dealt with his death. And it was a very, very difficult thing. It's a very, very difficult thing for a church. If a pastor dies, or if they're killed in a tragic way, but when they're murdered in a hate crime, it's totally devastating for a church. And our church in Sacramento experienced that. I had an assistant pastor named Reverend Ed Sheriff. He was originally from the Church of God of Prophecy. When the church discovered he was gay, he was committed to a mental hospital. He had over 40 electroshock treatments before he was released. He went into a regular business up in Spokane, Washington. And yet the fact that he was a minister stayed with him. And when he heard about Metropolitan Community Church, when the Metropolitan Community Church came to the Spokane area, he became a part of the church. And he came to Sacramento to be with me as my assistant pastor. And he was a most incredible man with a heart for people. Well, number one, he just was full of praise and worship. He was giving. He gave. We used to have evangelists come to Sacramento, and he would pull out $100 bill and he'd hold it up and he'd say, you know, this is what I'm giving. He says, y'all hold up your money. He says, hold up your money now. Go get it. You know, and the rest of us, I mean, we'd be out there grabbing money like this, because he inspired. He inspired. He was totally giving. He, with our church, founded a thrift shop and a meal program that he was able to feed hundreds of people. Just an absolute incredible man. And then one night I got the phone call that he'd been murdered. Hate crime, and a robbery, but it was so vicious. Stabbed and stabbed and stabbed and stabbed, and our church was just demoralized. But they hung together, and I made it through that too. I made it through. I don't even know what to say. I just know that probably, as far as facing death, as far as being involved in death, as far as being right with death, as far as being death of people who are abandoned and people who are despised and people who are victims of hate crimes, you know, that you have to know that there is a peace that passes all understanding. There is a belief that transcends the horror of all of that, and it's there and it's available, and you get it. You get it from seeking inside. You get it because you say, I'm going to go on, I've got to go on. You get it because you don't want to lose your compassion. You know, I think that's probably the greatest illness in the helping profession that there is that people become hardened to pain, and become hardened to grief, and they become hardened to tragedy, and they feel like they're saving themselves because they're making themselves hard and they're not letting themselves feel, but they are losing that essential human part of them that is so important. And you know, it communicates across. If you don't really care that the person in front of you is dying, if it does not wrench your soul, if it does not totally devastate you, you have lost something very, very important. I grieve for Reverend Ed, I grieve for Larry, I grieve for Chuck, I grieve for all of the ones who died, whether it's tragedy or with AIDS, and yet, you know, if someone called me right now and said, Frida, I just got this diagnosis, I'd be there. I'd be there, I'd put my arms around them, and we'd go through it. We'd go through it.
Yeah. It's really powerful. I can see it still. It's right there.
Well, it is. I mean, that's, that is, that's how life goes. That's how life goes. It's precious. People are precious. Every moment you spend with people is precious.
Yeah. What year did Reverend Ed come to River City MCC?
I would say that he came, it was probably about 1989 when he came.
Okay.
That's just, because he was our district coordinator.
Right.
And yet, when he came to Sacramento, he fell in love with Sacramento, with the people of Sacramento. And I certainly was very, very blessed that he was willing to come and to be a part of my staff. He did. He was just such an incredible person, and he was able to do so much. And you know, what I know about Reverend Ed is I believe because of his heart, I believe that somewhere he would even forgive the person who killed him. I mean, he had that kind of a heart.
Yeah.
When the person went on trial, I was able to speak. I said Reverend Ed was opposed to the death penalty. I spoke, and I believe that the spirit of Reverend Ed was with me in saying we do not want to see the death penalty for this terrible crime. And the man got life without possibility of parole. But I believe that had Reverend Ed been standing right there and aware of everything that had happened, that's what he would have done.
How long did the Stockton Church survive the loss of their pastor before they closed the first time?
I would say, right offhand, it was just a couple of years. It was very demoralizing there in Stockton, and then Stockton did not have an MCC for a number of years, and then Valley Ministries came into the valley, and Stockton, Modesto, up into Sacramento, and has this fantastic ministry there in Stockton now that I think it's just fire, right? The phoenix rising from ashes.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, because that was a devastating thing to happen to the church in Stockton. It was devastating in Sacramento too, but somehow, you know, we went on.
Yeah. Feels very much like baptism by fire.
And very much like baptism by fire. Very much, and you know, the interesting thing is that before 1970, which is when Troy had the first General Conference and founded the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. Before 1970, if AIDS had come with the same viciousness, that the same callousness toward the fact that it was gay people in general who were dying, it would have been so much worse, because it was like we were there. We were a church. We had a support staff. We had a way of ministering to people. We had a way of being able to even bury our dead. And sometimes, in some churches where members of the church actually, when the helping professions, when the medical profession or thing wouldn't come in and bathe the body, we had parishioners who would stay with someone, and as they died, they'd bathe the body, they'd prepare them, and for just like Jesus being prepared for the tomb. What if MCC hadn't been there?
Wow. Because nobody would do it, because they didn't want to touch
They
them.
didn't want it,
Wow.
but there was no place to go to. Where did you go to talk if you were gay? And said, I just got my diagnosis. So many came into my office, I just got my diagnosis.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful.
Well, that was, I did my master's thesis, which is up there somewhere, but it's on, excuse me, I'm
Go
going
for
to
it. Yeah,
jump up right here real quick. AIDS, a clarification along Foucault's line.
Wow.
This is my master's thesis for my Master of Arts in Psychology, and it was on AIDS. It was on the dialogue around AIDS and how it was unspeakable until Coop, the Assistant Surgeon General.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
1988. That was in the throes.
Yeah. That was still
It was raging.
when there
and
was no
there was-
answer.
Yeah.
Wow. Awesome.
Right over there.
Yeah. Very cool. So just outside of all that,
Okay.
you're as a elder, as a pastor, as first ordained woman, as your history at MCC, what is your greatest accomplishment? And then if you wanted to kind of speak on what you were saying earlier about you believe this to be a revolutionary.
Oh, okay. Let's say, I don't know if I could say I have a greatest accomplishment. I was very, very fortunate. You almost have to believe in fate. It seemed that I was always in the right place at the right time. I do believe, and I've preached it, and I say it, and some people think it's hyperbole, and some people think I'm exaggerating. But I believe that what happened in Metropolitan Community Church was the new reformation of the Christian church. If I look back into 1970, if I look into the role of women in the church, if I look at any church, and not any church, other than really the evangelical church or the Salvation Army that I came out of, and even there, by and large, women did not have an active role in the church. Gay people were thrown out everywhere. And I believe that, and people from different churches couldn't get along. I mean, talk about alley cats. you know, they fight and fight and fight over the slightest little interpretation. You know, Don Eastman used to say, he talked about church fights. I don't know if anybody out here has ever been in a church fight, but he says they get at the church fights. He says they're just like alley cats. You yell this noise and confusion and bedlam, and the result is just more churches.
That's true.
They split, and there's more churches. But ecumenism. How do you get Baptists and Catholics and Seventh-day Adventists and Church of God of Prophecy, Pentecostals, all worshiping together? How did that happen? It didn't even happen in the National Council of Churches except just once. The only time the National Council of Churches ever had communion in a meeting because they couldn't agree on how to do it was when MCC conducted the service, and Reverend Elder Nancy Wilson and I consecrated the communion. And churches just, they can't do it. But we took people from every walk of life, every class, every color, every religious denominational background, every educational level, and we washed them all together, and we said, we're a church. And we're going to do church things because this world is up, and we're going to change the world. And we did. And it's still changing.
Yeah.
I think you should do something on feminism in the church. I think you should just grab my mantle and run with it and say, wait, now let's remember it wasn't that long ago, and let's know that there are places in this world that need for women to be standing up for other women and to stop terrible savage practices and to stop the way that women are treated. And there are churches in those countries where women are being treated that way, and yet women are not valued or not even recognized as full people.
Yeah.
You know, because the church, as I've said before, is the brotherhood of God under the Father, and the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, and women are expendable and need to keep their heads covered and their mouths shut in church.
Yeah.
And you know that's mostly not true in the United States now. That's mostly not true in Canada or England or Australia or anywhere that we exist, but it's definitely true in a lot of parts of the world. And you know, women should be concerned about that. That should be an issue. That should be an issue in the Christian church, saying, okay, we need to be standing up and bringing in and empowering. You know, not just charitable stuff, but empowering people to be their full selves. And to claim their right, you know, that there is neither Hebrew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but you are one in Christ Jesus, for heaven's sakes. That's the church.
Yeah. Would you say that's your biggest passion?
I would say my biggest passion is, and I preach this, but to reach out to everyone who's been left out, to say, you shouldn't be left out. And hey, you're leaving them out. Why are you doing that? And hey, don't stand for that anymore. Get up on your hind legs. You know, tell them, no, I exist.
Okay.
You know, you talk about human rights. Well, okay, let's see how far you're willing to go. Might be surprised.
We have a long way to go. Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that I would say there's several things I would say. Number one, I totally believe that within each of us there's a component that's a spiritual component that's just as important as your emotional or your physical component. That's just as real. It strengthens, it nourishes the soul. And it exists, and to the degree that you recognize your spiritual self, and you got it anyway. You know, it's not just not there because you don't believe it's there, but you have this spiritual self that has a desire to worship that which is worthy of worship. You know that, and you worship things that are not worthy of worship because you're going to worship something. You're going to worship money or power, or you're going to worship something, but it's not going to satisfy because it's not worthy of worship. And the only thing that's worthy of worship is something that is so good, so powerful, so true, so liberating, that you're just energized through that worship itself. So, but I just really hate the fact that some churches think they own that. You know, you can't have it. You're a woman. Oh, you can't have that. You're gay. Oh no, you can't have that. You're divorced. Oh no, you can't have that. Your mother and father weren't married when you were born. You know, those are many passions.
Yeah.
Many passions.
Yeah. The left